The harsh desert sun hung like a fiery medallion in the cloudless sky as Nathaniel Valenti squinted at the distant horizon, wiping sweat from his weathered brow. His 34th birthday had passed without celebration, just like the 7 before it. 7 years of solitude on a ranch that demanded everything and offered little in return, except for the quiet comfort of belonging to no one but himself. The year was 1875, and Guthrie, Arizona Territory, was slowly transforming from a dusty outpost into something resembling a proper town. But Nathaniel's Broken Spur Ranch remained deliberately isolated, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor and 20 from town, just how he liked it. "Go on, get," he shouted, directing his cattle toward fresh grazing land. His faithful border collie, Scout, darted between the lumbering beasts, nipping at their heels and keeping the herd together with practiced efficiency. The sun was beginning its descent when Nathaniel finally returned to the ranch house, a modest 2-bedroom structure he'd built himself, expanding on the original 1-room cabin. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the windmill creaked a melancholy tune as it turned in the evening breeze. It wasn't much, but it was his, paid for with years of backbreaking work and stubborn determination. Inside, dust collected in the corners of rooms that had never known a woman's touch. Nathaniel's boots left tracks across the wooden floor as he moved to the kitchen. Dinner would be the same as always: beans, jerky, and cornbread if he felt ambitious. He wasn't expecting company, he never did, but fate had other plans. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, the early spring air carrying both promise and chill. Nathaniel was mending a fence in the north pasture when Scout's urgent barking caught his attention. The dog raced toward the main road, hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" Nathaniel called, dropping his tools and following the agitated animal. As he crested the small rise that separated his property from the rutted dirt road, he saw it: a wagon with a broken wheel, tilting precariously to one side. A woman stood beside it, hands on her hips, surveying the damage with obvious frustration. Strangers were rare enough in these parts, but a woman traveling alone was downright peculiar. Caution made him check the revolver on his hip before approaching. "Need some help, madam?" he called, keeping his distance. She whirled around, startled by his voice. Dark auburn hair escaped from beneath a practical bonnet, framing a face that was neither conventionally beautiful nor easily forgotten. There was character in that face, determination in the set of her jaw, intelligence in her clear green eyes. "I certainly do," she replied, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "Unless you happen to know where I might find Nathaniel Valenti," his steps faltered. "You're looking at him." "Well, Mr. Valenti," she said, extending a gloved hand, "I'm Victoria Vernon, your new housekeeper." Nathaniel stared at her outstretched hand as if it were a rattlesnake. "My what? Your housekeeper," she repeated, her smile faltering slightly. "Didn't you receive my letter? I responded to your advertisement in the Arizona Star last month." "I didn't place any advertisement," he said flatly. Victoria's face fell. She reached into her satchel and produced a folded newspaper clipping. "This isn't yours." Nathaniel snatched the paper from her hand, reading with growing disbelief. "Housekeeper wanted. Single man seeks capable woman to manage household duties on established cattle ranch near Guthrie. Room, board, and fair wages offered. Apply by mail to N. Valenti, General Delivery, Guthrie, Arizona Territory." "This is someone's idea of a joke," Nathaniel growled, crumpling the paper in his fist. "Probably Wade McDermott. Man thinks he's hilarious." Victoria's composure wavered for the first time. "You mean to tell me I've traveled over 1,000 miles for a position that doesn't exist?" The weight of her situation hit him suddenly. This woman had crossed the country based on a false promise. She stood before him with her entire life packed in the wagon behind her. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. "Philadelphia," she replied, lifting her chin. "Though most recently Boston. A city woman." That explained the quality of her clothing and the precise way she spoke. What it didn't explain was why she'd venture to the Arizona Territory for a housekeeper position. "Look, Miss Vernon, Mrs. Vernon," she corrected. "I'm a widow." That explained more. Widows often had few options, especially young ones. She couldn't be much older than 25. "Mrs. Vernon, he amended, I'm sorry for your trouble, but I don't need a housekeeper. I've managed just fine on my own for years. Her eyes swept over him, taking in his patched shirt, the worn elbows of his jacket, and the frayed collar. Have you? The state of your attire suggests otherwise. Nathaniel felt heat rise to his face. What I wear on the ranch is my business. Of course, she conceded, though her expression remained doubtful. She glanced back at her damaged wagon. I don't suppose you could direct me to the nearest hotel. Once I repair my wheel, I'll need somewhere to stay while I figure out my next steps. Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably. The nearest hotel was in Guthrie, and no respectable woman should travel that road alone, especially with a damaged wagon. Bandits and opportunists were common enough that he carried his revolver even on his own property. That wheel can't be fixed without proper tools, he said finally. I can take you to town tomorrow. You can stay in the spare room tonight. Victoria studied him carefully. Are you certain? I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition, he muttered, though it absolutely was. It's just one night. He helped her retrieve a carpetbag from the wagon, leaving the rest of her belongings secured under the canvas cover. As they walked toward the ranch house, Scout circled them warily, unsure what to make of this intruder in their carefully ordered life. Your dog is beautiful, Victoria commented, extending her hand for Scout to sniff. What's his name? Scout, Nathaniel replied, surprised when the typically aloof dog allowed her to scratch behind his ears. He doesn't usually take to strangers. Animals are excellent judges of character, she said with a small smile. Perhaps he knows I mean no harm. As they approached the house, Nathaniel became acutely aware of its shortcomings. The peeling paint, the missing shingles, the general air of neglect that pervaded everything except the barn and corrals. The livestock was well tended, the home was not. Victoria paused at the bottom of the porch steps, taking in the scene. If she was horrified by what she saw, she concealed it well. It has good bones, she said diplomatically. Nathaniel opened the front door, suddenly embarrassed by the state of his home. Dirty dishes were piled in the kitchen sink. Dust coated every surface. Clothes were draped over chairs, and his boots from the previous day lay where he'd kicked them off. I wasn't expecting company, he said gruffly. Clearly, Victoria replied, but there was no judgment in her tone, only observation. She set her bag down and removed her gloves, revealing slender hands with a callus or two that suggested she wasn't afraid of work. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. Before Nathaniel could answer, she was rolling up her sleeves and filling a basin with water from the pump at the sink. Mrs. Vernon, you don't have to. I'm not comfortable being idle, she said simply. And if I'm to stay here tonight, I'd prefer a clean plate for my dinner, wouldn't you? He had no reasonable argument against that. I need to finish mending that fence. I'll be back around sundown, she nodded, already sorting through the dishes with brisk efficiency. I'll see what I can do about dinner as well. Nathaniel escaped to the north pasture, feeling oddly like he was the intruder rather than her. By the time he returned, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple. He paused at the door, struck by an unfamiliar scent wafting from within, fresh bread, meat, and was that apple pie. Stepping inside, he nearly dropped his tools. The house was transformed. The floor had been swept, the dishes cleaned and put away. A fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, and the table was set with his mismatched dishes, somehow arranged to look intentional rather than haphazard. Victoria emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She'd removed her traveling dress and wore a simple blue cotton dress with a white apron. Her hair was neatly pinned up, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the changed surroundings. I found your pantry surprisingly well stocked, though disorganized. I took the liberty of making a proper dinner. Nathaniel stood speechless. It had been years since anyone had cooked for him. Years since the house had been anything more than a place to sleep and escape the elements. Thank you, he managed finally. It's the least I could do for your hospitality, she replied. There's water heated if you'd like to wash up before dinner. The meal was simple but far better than anything Nathaniel had eaten in years. Venison stew, fresh bread, and vegetables he'd forgotten he'd put up last fall. For dessert, she'd somehow produced an apple pie using dried apples from his pantry. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked, helping himself to a second slice of pie. My mother taught me the basics, Victoria replied, but I perfected my skills during my marriage. My husband was a professor at Harvard. He entertained colleagues frequently. A professor's wife, Nathaniel mused. That's a far cry from a ranch housekeeper. Something flickered across her face, a shadow of grief or regret before she composed herself. Life rarely follows the path we expect, Mr. Valenti. After Thomas died, I found Boston suffocating. Too many memories, too many well-meaning friends trying to arrange my future. I needed a fresh start. So you answered a false advertisement and traveled to the middle of nowhere. She met his gaze steadily. I researched carefully before making my decision. The Arizona territory is growing. There are opportunities here for those willing to work hard. And your advertisement, she faltered slightly. Well, it seemed perfect. A position where I could be useful without complications. Nathaniel understood the unspoken implication. A widow, especially a young and not unattractive one, would find herself pursued by suitors or worse. A remote position as a housekeeper offered protection from such entanglements. I'll help you get to town tomorrow, he said. Guthrie's growing. I'm sure you can find suitable employment. Of course, Victoria said, though something like disappointment crossed her features. I appreciate your assistance. After dinner, Nathaniel showed her to the spare room, which was little more than a storage space with a narrow bed. Victoria thanked him with such genuine gratitude that he felt ashamed of its sparseness. Later, as he lay in his own bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about his house, Nathaniel found himself more unsettled than he cared to admit. 7 years of solitude had made him uncomfortable with even the most basic human interactions. Yet there was something about Victoria Vernon that didn't fit his expectation of an Eastern widow. Beneath her proper exterior was a resilience that reminded him of the frontier women who had carved lives out of this unforgiving territory. Morning came with another surprise, the smell of coffee and bacon. Nathaniel dressed quickly and found Victoria already up, preparing breakfast as if she'd been doing it for years. Good morning, she greeted him cheerfully. I hope you don't mind, but I fed your dog. He seemed quite insistent. Scout, the trader, sat at her feet looking thoroughly content. He's never gotten table scraps before, Nathaniel said, pouring himself coffee. Oh, I didn't give him scraps, Victoria clarified. I made him proper dog food with some of the meat trimmings and grain. My father always said a working dog deserves proper meals. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. Your father had dogs. He bred hunting dogs, she said, placing a plate of eggs and bacon before him. Our home outside Philadelphia was modest, but the kennels were renowned throughout Pennsylvania. Another piece of the puzzle that was Victoria Vernon fell into place. She wasn't some delicate city woman who had never seen dirt. She'd grown up around animals and understood their value. After breakfast, they hitched up Nathaniel's wagon and loaded Victoria's carpet bag. He planned to return later for her damaged wagon and the rest of her belongings. As they set off toward town, Victoria gazed at the landscape with undisguised appreciation. It's beautiful in its own way, she observed. So different from the East, there's a clarity to everything here. Nathaniel followed her gaze to the distant mountains, purple against the morning sky. He'd long since stopped noticing the beauty of his surroundings, focusing instead on its challenges and dangers. It can kill you if you're not careful, he said. So can Boston, she replied wryly. The dangers are just less obvious. The journey to town passed quickly, with Victoria asking intelligent questions about ranching and the local terrain. By the time they reached Guthrie, Nathaniel found himself explaining his breeding program for the cattle and his plans to expand into horses, things he rarely discussed with anyone. Guthrie had grown substantially in recent years, boasting several saloons, a general store, a small hotel, and even a church. As they pulled up to the hotel, Nathaniel noticed Victoria's expression tighten slightly. Everything all right? He asked. Yes, she said, though her smile seemed forced. I just realized I should inquire about employment opportunities while I'm here, perhaps at the general store. Nathaniel helped her down from the wagon. I'll ask around about who might have placed that false advertisement. It wasn't right, bringing you all this way on false pretenses. I appreciate that, Victoria said, extending her hand. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Valenti. He shook her hand awkwardly, suddenly aware of how rough his palm must feel against her smoother one. Good luck, Mrs. Vernon. Nathaniel's first stop was the general store, where he intended to stock up on supplies and perhaps inquire about employment for Victoria. Wade McDermott, the store owner and Nathaniel's closest thing to a friend in these parts, greeted him with surprise. Twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record for you, Valenti. I'm not here to socialize, Nathaniel replied, placing his list on the counter. I need these items, and I need to know who's been impersonating me in the newspaper. Wade's bushy eyebrows rose. Impersonating you? What are you talking about? Nathaniel explained about the advertisement and Victoria's arrival. As he spoke, Wade's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, and finally to something like mischief. Well now, that's interesting, Wade said, stroking his beard. Because I distinctly remember you coming in here about 2 months back, having a drink with me and Sheriff Palmer, and saying, and I quote, "This place is falling down around my ears. I need a housekeeper, but where in tarnation am I going to find a woman willing to live that far out?" Nathaniel stared at him. I never said that. You absolutely did, Wade insisted. After your fourth whiskey, and I said, why don't you advertise in the paper, lots of respectable women back east looking for a fresh start, and you said, go ahead then if you think it'll work. A vague, uncomfortable memory surfaced in Nathaniel's mind. He had come to town after a particularly difficult calving season when exhaustion had driven him to seek human company for once, and he had drunk more than usual. You placed that advertisement based on a drunken conversation. He demanded. Wade shrugged. You seemed pretty sincere at the time, and I paid for it myself as a favor, I might add. You're welcome. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Well, now there's a widow from Boston staying at the hotel because of your favor, and I need to find her a proper position. Wade leaned across the counter. Is she pretty? That's not relevant, Nathaniel snapped, though the image of Victoria's determined green eyes flashed unbidden in his mind. Competent, then? Nathaniel hesitated. She managed to clean my entire house, cook 3 excellent meals, and apparently make proper food for my dog in less than 24 hours. Sounds like exactly what you needed, Wade said with a knowing grin. Why are you trying to find her another position? Because I don't need a housekeeper. Wade gave him a skeptical look. Your shirt's buttoned wrong, there's a hole in your sleeve, and I'd bet my store that before she cleaned it, your house was fit for livestock rather than humans. Nathaniel glanced down and discovered that Wade was right about the buttons. Swearing under his breath, he began fixing them. She's an educated woman, he argued. A professor's widow, she belongs somewhere civilized, not stuck out at Broken Spur with nothing but cattle and cactus for company. Why don't you let her decide that? Wade suggested. Offer her the position properly, for real this time. If she accepts, well, then you both get what you need. If she refuses, no harm done. The idea was so logical that Nathaniel had no immediate argument against it. He finished his shopping in silence, his mind working through the possibilities. The truth was, his home had never felt so much like a home as it had during the brief time Victoria was there, and the thought of returning to his solitary existence seemed suddenly less appealing than it had 2 days ago. I'll think about it, he said finally, gathering his purchases. Wade's knowing smile followed him out the door. At the hotel, Nathaniel hesitated before entering. What if she laughed at the offer? What if she thought he was propositioning her? The latter thought made him flush with embarrassment. He would need to make the terms very clear, employment only, strictly professional. He found Victoria in the small dining room, staring at a cup of coffee with a worried expression. When she saw him, surprise and something like relief crossed her face. Mr. Valenti. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Mrs. Vernon, he nodded, removing his hat. May I join you? She gestured to the empty chair across from her. Please, did you discover who placed the advertisement? Nathaniel sat down, feeling awkward and oversized in the dainty hotel chair. As it happens, I did. Apparently, I did. Victoria's eyebrows rose. He explained about the conversation with Wade and the whiskey-influenced agreement. As he spoke, Victoria's expression shifted from confusion to amusement. So it was a legitimate offer, she said, made under the influence of alcohol and then forgotten? It appears so, Nathaniel admitted. And I've come to make the offer officially, if you're still interested. Victoria sat back, studying him with those perceptive green eyes. Are you certain? Yesterday you seemed quite content with your solitary existence. Nathaniel chose his words carefully. I've managed alone for 7 years, but I won't pretend your presence didn't improve things. The house hasn't been that clean since. Well, ever, and you're cooking. He cleared his throat. What I'm saying is, the position is yours if you want it. Room, board, and wages as the advertisement stated. And what exactly would my duties entail? Victoria asked, her tone businesslike. Cooking, cleaning, mending, Nathaniel listed. General household management. Nothing inappropriate, he added hastily. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. I didn't imagine you were offering anything inappropriate, Mr. Valenti. You don't strike me as that sort of man. He relaxed slightly. The work will be hard and the isolation isn't for everyone. Guthrie's growing, but it's still 20 miles from the ranch. I come to town once a month at most. I understand, she said, folding her hands on the table. May I ask about the accommodations, the spare room? Would be yours to arrange as you see fit, he said. It needs work, I know. The whole house does, but you'd have authority over household matters. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, she asked, when would you like me to start? Relief washed over Nathaniel, though he kept his expression neutral. Today, if you're agreeable. We can collect your wagon and belongings on the way back. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Valenti, Victoria said, extending her hand once more. This time when they shook, it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The return journey was considerably more relaxed than the trip into town. They stopped to secure Victoria's damaged wagon, transferring her remaining belongings to Nathaniel's wagon. Among them was a trunk full of books that made Nathaniel raise his eyebrows. Light reading? He asked as he hefted it into the wagon. Victoria smiled. A small portion of my library. I couldn't bear to leave all my books behind. What do you read? Everything, she replied. History, natural science, poetry, novels. Knowledge is never wasted, don't you think? Nathaniel couldn't remember the last time he'd read anything besides the newspaper or agricultural bulletins. I suppose not. As they continued toward the ranch, Victoria pointed out wildflowers and birds, naming several that Nathaniel had seen for years but never identified. Her enthusiasm was infectious, making him see his familiar surroundings through new eyes. Upon reaching Broken Spur, Nathaniel showed Victoria around properly, explaining the layout of the ranch and introducing her to the handful of horses in the corral. She paid careful attention, asking questions that revealed her practical nature despite her refined upbringing. That windmill needs repair, she observed, pointing to the creaking structure. The sound suggests the bearings are worn. Nathaniel was impressed. You know about windmills? My father believed girls should understand how things work just as well as boys, she replied. I may not be able to fix it myself, but I can diagnose most mechanical problems. Over the next few days, a routine began to develop. Victoria rose early, preparing breakfast before Nathaniel headed out to work the ranch. She spent her days transforming the house, sweeping, scrubbing, organizing, and repairing what she could. Every evening, Nathaniel returned to a clean home and a hot meal, luxuries he hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. 1 week into her employment, Nathaniel returned from checking the western pasture to find Victoria on a ladder, painting the front of the house. What are you doing? He called, dismounting quickly. Painting, she replied, as if it were perfectly normal to find a woman balanced precariously on a ladder with a paintbrush in hand. I found cans of paint in the shed. They're still good. That's not housekeeping, Nathaniel protested. It's too dangerous. You could fall. Victoria descended the ladder with easy grace. I've finished my indoor tasks. The exterior needs attention before the summer heat sets in, or the wood will suffer further damage. She gestured to the partially painted wall. Don't you think it looks better? It did. The fresh paint transformed the weathered boards, making them look solid and cared for rather than abandoned. It's not your responsibility, he said, though with less conviction. I disagree, Victoria replied calmly. You hired me to manage your household. That includes maintaining its appearance, unless you'd prefer to do the painting yourself. They both knew he had no time for such tasks between managing the cattle, repairing fences, and the 100 other chores that filled his days. Nathaniel conceded with a nod. Just be careful, he said. I don't need an injured housekeeper on my hands, Victoria smiled. I've been climbing ladders since I was 10. I helped paint our barn every spring. That evening, as they ate dinner, Nathaniel found himself watching Victoria more closely. Her capable hands, the confident way she moved around the kitchen, the occasional humming under her breath as she worked all spoke of a woman at ease with herself and her place in the world, despite the recent upheaval in her life. "Tell me about your husband," he said suddenly. Victoria paused, surprise evident on her face. "Thomas, what would you like to know?" "Whatever you care to share," Nathaniel replied, realizing how personal his request was. "I'm sorry if the question is too forward." "Not at all," she said, though her eyes grew distant. Thomas Vernon was brilliant, a professor of natural philosophy at Harvard specializing in geology. We met when I accompanied my father to a lecture. Thomas was passionate about his work, devoted to his students. She smiled sadly. He was 20 years my senior but possessed the enthusiasm of a much younger man. "What happened to him?" Nathaniel asked gently. "Pneumonia," Victoria replied. "3 winters ago. It came on suddenly and took him within a week. After his death, I discovered he had been generous with his colleagues but careless with his finances. I sold our home to pay his debts and took a position as a companion to an elderly lady until her death last year." The quiet dignity with which she recounted her losses made Nathaniel's throat tighten. "I'm sorry." Victoria nodded in acknowledgement. "And you, have you always lived alone?" Nathaniel considered deflecting the question but found himself answering honestly. "No. This was my parents' ranch originally. They came out from Texas in '56 when Arizona was still mostly untamed, built this place from nothing." He glanced around the kitchen, remembering how it had been when his mother was alive. "They died during a cholera outbreak in '68. My younger brother went back east to live with our aunt. I stayed to keep the ranch going." "You were very young to take on such responsibility," Victoria observed. 27, Nathaniel shrugged. "Old enough. And no wife, family of your own," a shadow crossed his face. "There was someone once, Margaret. We were engaged before my parents died. Afterward, she decided the life of a rancher's wife wasn't what she wanted after all." "I'm sorry," Victoria said softly. "It was a long time ago," Nathaniel replied, though the memory still carried a sting. "She married the banker's son, moved to Tucson. They have 3 children now." Victoria seemed to sense his discomfort with the topic and skillfully steered the conversation to more neutral ground. "I noticed your library is rather limited. Would you object if I organized the bookshelves and perhaps added some of my own volumes to the collection?" Nathaniel welcomed the change of subject. "Not at all, though I doubt I'll have much time for reading. Winter evenings can be long," Victoria said. "And there's something comforting about having books nearby, even if you only manage a page or two before sleep claims you." Her words conjured an image of Victoria sitting by the fire on a cold winter night, book in hand, while snow piled against the windows. It was an unexpectedly appealing vision. "Do whatever you like with the bookshelves," he said. "Consider the house your domain." Victoria's smile was warm enough to chase away the lingering sadness their conversation had stirred. "Thank you, Mr. Valenti. I appreciate your trust." As spring gave way to early summer, Victoria's influence spread throughout the ranch. The house gleamed with polish and care. Curtains appeared at windows that had been bare for years. The spare room transformed into a comfortable chamber with Victoria's personal touches. A colorful quilt on the bed, her books on a small shelf, a vase of wildflowers on the dresser. Outside, she established a vegetable garden, coaxing tomatoes, squash, and beans from the reluctant soil through diligent watering and care. She planted herbs near the kitchen door and flowers along the front path. When a stray cat appeared in the barn, Victoria promptly named her Duchess and enlisted her services as chief mouser, rewarding the feline with saucers of milk and comfortable bedding in the storage room. Most surprising to Nathaniel was how Victoria's presence affected the atmosphere of the ranch. Where silence had reigned for years, now there was often humming or soft singing as she worked. She greeted him each morning with genuine warmth and listened with interest to his accounts of the day's challenges each evening. For his part, Nathaniel found himself making small adjustments to accommodate her presence. He began wiping his boots before entering the house, hanging his hat on the peg by the door instead of tossing it on the nearest surface, and washing up more thoroughly before meals. He started bringing her wildflowers or interesting stones he found while riding the range, enjoying her delight at these small offerings. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Scout lay at Victoria's feet, having thoroughly transferred his allegiance to the person who provided him with regular meals and ear scratches. "I received a letter from my brother today," Nathaniel said, breaking the comfortable silence. Victoria looked up from her mending. "From back east." "How is he?" "Well enough. Married now with a baby on the way. He's a lawyer in Boston." "Boston." Victoria's needle paused mid-stitch. "What's his name? Perhaps I knew of him when I lived there." "Daniel Valenti," Nathaniel replied, "though I doubt your paths would have crossed. He moves in different circles than a university professor would." Victoria's expression turned thoughtful. "The name is familiar, actually. I believe he may have handled some affairs for my late employer, Mrs. Harrington. It's a small world, isn't it?" The connection, however tenuous, created an unexpected bridge between their disparate backgrounds. As they discussed the coincidence, Nathaniel found himself studying Victoria's profile against the darkening sky. The sunset cast a golden glow on her skin, illuminating flecks of amber in her green eyes. She had secured her hair in a practical knot for the day's work, but a few strands had escaped to curl around her face. Something shifted in Nathaniel's chest, a warming, a loosening of a tightness he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The realization that he found Victoria not merely competent but genuinely appealing as a woman sent a jolt of panic through him. He stood abruptly. "I should check on that new calf," he said, though there was no urgent need to do so. Victoria looked up in surprise. "Of course, don't let me keep you." As Nathaniel strode toward the barn, he silently berated himself. Victoria Vernon was his employee, not someone to develop feelings for. She had come here seeking a position, not a husband. The last thing she needed was unwanted attention from her employer, but over the following weeks, Nathaniel found it increasingly difficult to maintain emotional distance. Every meal shared, every conversation on the porch, every small domestic comfort Victoria created pulled him further from his self-imposed isolation. He began finding excuses to return to the house during the day, tools he'd forgotten, questions about supplies, updates on livestock that could easily have waited until evening. Victoria never seemed to mind these interruptions. She welcomed him with the same steady warmth whether he'd been gone for hours or minutes. Sometimes he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, thoughtful, almost wistful, but she always turned away when their eyes met, as if embarrassed to be caught looking. July brought scorching heat that tested everyone's endurance. The days stretched long and punishing, with temperatures soaring well above 100 degrees by midday. Nathaniel worried about Victoria in such conditions, but she adapted with practical determination, rising before dawn to complete outdoor tasks, retreating indoors during the worst of the heat, and emerging again in the relative cool of the evening to tend her garden. One particularly brutal afternoon, Nathaniel returned from repairing a distant fence line, sweat-soaked and light-headed from the heat. He found Victoria in the kitchen, her face flushed as she worked over the stove despite the sweltering temperature. "You'll make yourself sick in this heat," he said, accepting the glass of cool water she offered him. "I'm nearly finished," she replied, wiping perspiration from her brow with her sleeve. "I wanted to preserve these peaches before they spoiled. Mr. McDermott sent them with the supply wagon yesterday." Nathaniel noticed for the first time how exhausted she looked. 7 jars of golden peach preserves lined the counter, but Victoria herself seemed ready to collapse. "Enough," he said firmly, taking the wooden spoon from her hand. "The rest can wait." "But no arguments," Nathaniel said, guiding her to a chair. "Sit, drink some water. The peaches won't spoil in the next hour." Victoria obeyed, sinking into the chair with visible relief. "I didn't realize how much the heat had affected me," she admitted, sipping the water he handed her. "Thank you." Something protective rose in Nathaniel's chest. "You push yourself too hard," she smiled weakly. "Pot kettle, Mr. Valenti." He couldn't argue with that. Instead, he impulsively suggested, "There's a creek about a mile south of here. The water's cool, even in summer. We could ride out this evening once the sun's lower." Victoria's eyes brightened at the idea. A creek with actual flowing water, I'd like that very much. Later, as the worst of the day's heat began to subside, Nathaniel saddled 2 horses, his own stallion, Thunder, and a gentle mare named Daisy that Victoria had taken to riding occasionally on her rare leisure time. Victoria emerged from the house wearing a split riding skirt she'd sewn herself, her hair braided and pinned up securely under a wide-brimmed hat. They rode in comfortable silence, Victoria following Nathaniel's lead across the familiar landscape. The creek was a modest affair by Eastern standards, but in the Arizona desert, any reliable water source was precious. Shaded by cottonwoods and willows, it offered a natural oasis from the relentless sun. "It's beautiful," Victoria breathed as they dismounted. She removed her hat and fanned herself with it, gazing at the clear water flowing over smooth stones. "How did you find it?" "My father showed me when I was a boy," Nathaniel replied, loosening the horses' girths and allowing them to drink. "Said every rancher needs to know where water flows, even in the driest years." Victoria knelt by the creek, trailing her fingers through the cool water. "May I?" she asked, glancing up at him. Nathaniel nodded. "That's why we came." Without hesitation, Victoria removed her boots and stockings and waded ankle-deep into the stream, sighing with pleasure as the water flowed around her bare feet. The simple joy on her face made something tighten in Nathaniel's chest. "Join me," she called, gathering her skirts above her knees to wade deeper. "The water's wonderful." After a moment's hesitation, Nathaniel pulled off his boots and rolled up his pants' legs. The cool water was indeed a blessed relief after the day's heat. They waded side by side, pointing out tiny fish darting between stones and the tracks of deer and rabbits along the muddy banks. "I never imagined Arizona could be so beautiful," Victoria said, pausing to watch a hummingbird hover near a flowering cactus. "Everyone back east speaks of it as if it were nothing but barren desert and danger." "There's plenty of both," Nathaniel replied, "but there's beauty too, if you know where to look." He glanced at her, standing midstream with water flowing around her ankles, her face lifted to catch the breeze that rustled through the cottonwoods. "More beauty than I remembered lately." Victoria met his gaze, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Something passed between them, an awareness, an acknowledgement of the shifting nature of their relationship. For a breathless moment, Nathaniel thought he might take her hand or say something to bridge the gap between employer and whatever they were becoming. Instead, Scout, who had followed them to the creek, chose that moment to splash into the water, sending a shower of droplets over them both. Victoria laughed, the tension broken, and bent to splash the dog in return. "Traitor," Nathaniel muttered to Scout, though without heat. The dog merely wagged his tail and continued his enthusiastic exploration of the creek. By the time they returned to the ranch, twilight was settling over the desert. Stars pricked the darkening sky, and a 3/4 moon cast enough light to illuminate their path. Victoria was quiet on the ride back, but it was a comfortable silence, broken occasionally by observations about the emerging constellations or the call of a distant coyote. At the barn, Nathaniel helped her dismount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. "Thank you for the outing," Victoria said softly. "It was exactly what I needed." "My pleasure," Nathaniel replied, and was surprised to realize how genuinely he meant it. When was the last time he'd done something purely for pleasure? Victoria's presence was reawakening parts of himself he'd long neglected, not just the capacity for companionship, but for joy in simple things. That night, Nathaniel lay awake long after retiring, listening to the distant hooting of an owl and the gentle creaking of the house settling. Across the hallway, Victoria slept in what he had ceased to think of as the spare room and now considered wholly hers. The knowledge of her presence, peaceful, trusted, increasingly essential, both comforted and unsettled him. He was falling in love with his housekeeper. The realization wasn't a sudden epiphany, but rather an acknowledgement of something that had been growing for weeks. The question was, what would he do about it? Victoria had come to Broken Spur seeking employment, not romance. She had been clear about wanting to avoid complications. And while he sometimes thought he caught a similar awareness in her eyes, Nathaniel couldn't be sure it wasn't merely wishful thinking on his part. For now, he decided, he would do nothing. Better to preserve the harmony they had established than risk everything on feelings that might not be reciprocated. With that resolution, he finally drifted into sleep. August brought violent thunderstorms that transformed the normally dry landscape. Victoria watched in fascination as lightning split the sky and rain pounded the parched earth. "It's like the sky is having a tantrum," she observed one evening as they sat on the covered porch, watching nature's display. "These storms can be dangerous," Nathaniel warned. "Flash floods come out of nowhere. That's why I wanted to check all the high-ground pastures today." "Is that why you were late for dinner?" Victoria asked. "I was beginning to worry." The simple admission warmed him more than it should have. "No need to worry about me, I know this land." Victoria's smile was teasing. "Even the most knowledgeable men can find themselves in trouble, Mr. Valenti." "Nathaniel," he said suddenly. "After 4 months, I think you can call me Nathaniel instead of Mr. Valenti." Victoria looked startled, then pleased. "Very well, Nathaniel." "And you must call me Victoria." The exchange felt momentous somehow, as if they had crossed an invisible boundary. That night, Nathaniel dreamed of Victoria saying his name in a very different context and woke feeling both elated and guilty. The monsoon season continued, bringing life-giving moisture to the desert and a corresponding burst of activity on the ranch. New calves were born, the garden flourished, and the landscape transformed from brown to green almost overnight. Victoria marveled at the desert wildflowers that appeared as if by magic after the rains. "Nature is remarkably resilient," she commented one morning as they walked the perimeter of her now thriving garden. "All it needs is a little encouragement." "Like people," Nathaniel replied, thinking of how his own long dormant capacity for joy had reawakened under Victoria's influence. She glanced at him with that perceptive gaze that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. "Yes, exactly like people." Their daily routines had evolved into a comfortable partnership that extended beyond employer and employee. Victoria had learned to identify different cattle by their markings and could now tell at a glance which animals belonged to Broken Spur. Nathaniel, in turn, had developed an appreciation for the domestic arts, particularly Victoria's cooking, which incorporated both Eastern recipes and local ingredients in creative ways. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch, Victoria with her mending or a book, Nathaniel cleaning tack, or simply watching the desert sunset. Sometimes they talked about their childhoods, books Victoria had read, Nathaniel's plans for expanding the ranch. Other times they sat in companionable silence, each content with the other's presence. One particularly pleasant evening in late August, Victoria was reading aloud from a volume of Thoreau while Nathaniel whittled a piece of wood into what might eventually become a small horse. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Nathaniel was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver he kept nearby even at home. Visitors were rare, and unannounced visitors often meant trouble. "Stay here," he told Victoria, moving to the edge of the porch for a better view of the approaching rider. As the figure came into view, Nathaniel relaxed slightly. "It's Wade," he said, recognizing the storekeeper's distinctive silhouette. Wade McDermott rode up to the house at a leisurely pace, though his expression was serious beneath his bushy eyebrows. "Evening, Valenti," he called, dismounting stiffly. "Mrs. Vernon." "Mr. McDermott," Victoria replied with a polite nod. "What brings you out so far?" "Can I offer you some coffee or perhaps something stronger after your ride?" "Coffee would be mighty welcome," Wade said, removing his hat. "And I'm afraid it's bad news that brings me. There's been trouble in town." While Victoria went inside to prepare coffee, Wade explained the situation to Nathaniel. A gang of cattle rustlers had been operating in the area, growing bolder with each success. 2 days ago, they had raided the Peterson place 10 miles north of Guthrie, stealing livestock and burning the barn when Old Man Peterson tried to stop them. "Sheriffs forming a posse," Wade concluded. "Asked me to ride out and let you know, meeting tomorrow at dawn in town." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "I'll be there. These are my neighbors." Victoria returned with the coffee, catching the end of the conversation. Her face paled slightly, but she said nothing as she served the men, her movements precise and controlled. Wade stayed only long enough to drink his coffee and provide what details he had about the rustlers, a group of 5 or 6 men, well armed and organized, likely hiding in the Dragoon Mountains between raids. As he prepared to leave, he turned to Victoria. Mrs. Vernon, perhaps you'd be safer staying in town while the men are out searching. These aren't the kind of vermin you want to encounter alone. Before Victoria could respond, Nathaniel spoke. Victoria stays here. The ranch can't be left unattended, and she knows how to use a rifle. Wade raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. As you say, just be careful, both of you. These men don't hesitate to harm anyone who gets in their way. After Wade departed, a heavy silence fell between them. Nathaniel began gathering what he would need for the posse, his best rifle, ammunition, provisions for several days. How long will you be gone? Victoria asked finally, her voice steady despite the worry evident in her eyes. Hard to say. Days, maybe more if we have to track them into the mountains. Victoria nodded, then disappeared into the kitchen. She returned moments later with a small bundle. Bandages and salve, she explained, placing them in his saddlebag, just in case. The simple practicality of the gesture, combined with the concern behind it, made Nathaniel's throat tighten. Thank you. She met his gaze directly. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise, he replied, more solemnly than he intended. Victoria hesitated, then said quietly, I'll have everything ready for your return. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning beyond their simple practicality. Victoria wasn't just saying she would maintain the household in his absence. She was promising to be there when he came back. It was as close to an acknowledgement of their deepening connection as either had yet come. Nathaniel woke before dawn the next morning to find Victoria already up, preparing a hearty breakfast and packing food for his journey. They ate in subdued silence, the impending separation casting a shadow over the meal. As Nathaniel prepared to leave, Victoria handed him a final package of food. Enough for 2 days, she said. After that, you'll have to rely on your hunting skills. I'll manage, he assured her, securing the package in his saddlebag. At the door, he turned to her, suddenly reluctant to leave. Victoria stood straight-backed and composed, though her eyes betrayed her concern. Bar the doors at night, Nathaniel instructed. Keep the rifle loaded and close at hand. If there's any trouble, I know what to do, Victoria interrupted gently. I'll be fine. It's you who will be riding into danger. Before he could respond, she stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. Come back safely, Nathaniel, please. The touch, combined with the quiet intensity of her words, broke something loose inside him. Without planning to, Nathaniel drew her into his arms, holding her close for a brief, electric moment. Victoria stiffened in surprise, then relaxed against him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. I will, he promised, his voice rough with emotion. Then, gathering his courage, he pressed his lips to her forehead in a gesture that was somewhere between comfort and promise. When he pulled back, Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she managed a smile. I'll hold you to that. With a final nod, Nathaniel forced himself to leave, mounting Thunder and riding toward town without looking back. If he had, his resolve might have faltered at the sight of Victoria standing in the doorway, one hand raised in farewell, the other pressed to the spot where his lips had touched her skin. The posse gathered in Guthrie as dawn broke. 12 men, including Nathaniel, Sheriff Palmer, Wade, and ranchers from throughout the area. The sheriff laid out what they knew of the rustlers' movements and divided the men into pairs to cover more ground. Nathaniel was partnered with a young rancher named Jenkins, whose property adjoined Broken Spur on the eastern boundary. For 3 days, they tracked the rustlers through increasingly rugged terrain, following signs of cattle being driven hard through narrow passes. On the 4th day, they found the remains of a camp still warm, suggesting they were close behind their quarry. They're headed for the border, Sheriff Palmer concluded, studying the tracks, probably planning to sell the cattle in Mexico. We need to cut them off before they reach the pass through the mountains. The posse pushed on, riding hard through difficult country. Nathaniel's thoughts frequently turned to Victoria, alone at Broken Spur. He trusted her capability, but the knowledge that dangerous men were operating in the area made him increasingly anxious to complete the mission and return home. The word came naturally now, in a way it hadn't for years. Broken Spur had been his property, his responsibility, but not truly a home until Victoria arrived. On the fifth day, they caught up with the rustlers attempting to drive the stolen cattle through a narrow canyon toward the border. The ensuing gunfight was brief but intense. One rustler was killed, two wounded, and the rest captured. Among the recovered livestock were 3 Broken Spur calves identifiable by Nathaniel's brand. "You got lucky," Sheriff Palmer told him as they secured the prisoners for the journey back to Guthrie. They hadn't had time to alter the brands yet. The return journey was slower, hampered by the need to drive the recovered cattle and guard the prisoners. It was nearly dusk on the 8th day when they reached Guthrie. After ensuring the rustlers were securely jailed and providing his account to the sheriff, Nathaniel was free to return home. Though exhausted, he rode through the gathering darkness, driven by an urgent need to see Victoria, to confirm with his own eyes that she was safe. As Broken Spur came into view, he felt tension drain from his shoulders at the sight of lamplight glowing warmly from the windows. Victoria must have heard Thunder's approach, for she opened the door before Nathaniel had fully dismounted. She stood framed in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the light behind her, and the sight made his heart clench with a sudden, overwhelming certainty. "You're back," she said, her voice betraying more emotion than her composed features. "I promised I would be," Nathaniel replied, climbing the porch steps slowly, his body aching from days in the saddle. Victoria's careful restraint dissolved as he reached her. She stepped forward, her hands coming up to touch his face as if confirming he was real. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the cut along his temple where a bullet had grazed him during the gunfight. "It's nothing," he assured her, covering her hand with his own. "Just a scratch." They stood frozen in that tableau, her hand on his face, his covering hers, gazes locked in silent communication. Then Victoria seemed to collect herself, stepping back slightly. "You must be exhausted and hungry," she said. "Come inside. There's hot water for washing up and stew keeping warm on the stove." The familiar comfort of home clean towels, hot food, Victoria's quiet efficiency nearly undid Nathaniel. He washed away 8 days of dust and sweat, changed into fresh clothes she had laid out for him, and sat at the kitchen table while she served him stew and fresh bread. As he ate, Nathaniel recounted the events of the past week, carefully editing the more dangerous aspects. Victoria listened intently, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing him to tell the story at his own pace. "And the ranch, any problems while I was gone?" he asked when he had finished his account. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Victoria replied with a small smile. "Though there was a minor crisis when a fox tried to raid the henhouse. Fortunately, Scout and Duchess formed an unlikely alliance to drive it away." The image of his dog and the barn cat defending the chickens together made Nathaniel chuckle. "Sounds like you managed just fine without me." "I managed," Victoria agreed, "but I wouldn't say it was just fine. I worried about you constantly." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Nathaniel set down his spoon, suddenly more aware of Victoria's presence than of his own exhaustion or hunger. "I thought about you too," he said quietly. "Every day, every night, wondering if you were safe, wondering if—" He hesitated, then continued with determined honesty. "Wondering if you'd still be here when I returned." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. "Where else would I be?" "I don't know," Nathaniel admitted. "But I realized something while I was away. This place was never really a home until you came. It was just a house, a property I was responsible for. You've made it a home, Victoria, and the thought of coming back to find you gone was—" "I wouldn't leave," Victoria interrupted softly. "Not without saying goodbye, and I have no wish to say goodbye, Nathaniel." The implication of her words sent a surge of hope through him. "What are you saying exactly?" Victoria took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "I'm saying that my feelings for you have evolved beyond what is appropriate for an employee toward her employer. And if that makes my position here untenable, I understand, but I felt you should know the truth." Nathaniel stared at her, momentarily speechless. Victoria misinterpreted his silence, her face flushing as she began to rise from the table. "I apologize for my forwardness. Perhaps it would be best if I—" Nathaniel caught her hand, halting her retreat. "Victoria, wait." He stood as well, keeping her hand in his. "My feelings have evolved too. Far beyond what an employer should feel. I've been fighting it, telling myself you only wanted employment without complications, that you'd reject any suggestion of something more. Hope bloomed in Victoria's eyes. And now, Nathaniel said, drawing her closer, I'm tired of fighting what feels right, what feels like it was meant to be from the moment you arrived with that ridiculous fake advertisement. A smile curved Victoria's lips. It wasn't fake, just misdirected. The best mistake that ever happened to me, Nathaniel murmured, lifting her hand to his lips. Victoria's breath caught at the gesture. Nathaniel, she whispered, his name a question and an invitation all at once. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Nathaniel leaned forward and kissed her properly for the first time. Victoria responded immediately, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest as she returned the kiss with a fervor that matched his own. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Victoria Vernon. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you walked into my life and started ordering me around. Victoria laughed softly. I never ordered you around. You absolutely did, Nathaniel contradicted with a grin. And thank God for it. I needed someone to shake up my solitary existence. Well, Victoria said, her eyes sparkling with happiness, I love you too, Nathaniel Valenti. Even when you're being stubborn and tracking mud across my clean floors. Their second kiss was deeper, more certain, a promise of things to come. When they separated, Nathaniel kept his arms around her, unwilling to let go now that he had finally claimed the right to hold her. What happens now? Victoria asked, her head resting against his shoulder. That depends, Nathaniel replied. I'd like to court you properly if you'll allow it, and then, if you're willing, I'd like to make you my wife rather than my housekeeper. Victoria lifted her head to meet his gaze. I'd like that very much, she said simply. Though I hope I can still be something of a housekeeper as well. I've grown rather fond of this place. It's as much your home as mine now, Nathaniel assured her. You've put your mark on every corner of it. That night, they sat on the porch long after darkness fell, talking of the future of expanding the ranch, of children they might have, of the life they would build together. When Victoria finally retired to her room, it was with a lingering kiss that carried the promise of a lifetime of such moments to come. The following Sunday, they rode into Guthrie together, causing quite a stir when they attended church services side by side. Wade McDermott's knowing grin when he spotted them suggested he'd anticipated this outcome all along. After services, Nathaniel formally introduced Victoria to the townspeople not as his housekeeper, but as the woman he intended to marry. About time, Wade commented when they stopped at the general store afterward. I was beginning to think I'd have to place another advertisement. Victoria laughed. That won't be necessary, Mr. McDermott, though I do have you to thank for my current happiness. Just doing my civic duty, Wade replied with a wink. Couldn't have a fine ranch like Broken Spur falling to pieces for lack of a woman's touch, now could I? They married 6 weeks later with Sheriff Palmer officiating and half the county in attendance. The ceremony took place at Broken Spur, on the front porch that Victoria had repainted and decorated with wildflowers for the occasion. Victoria wore a simple ivory dress ordered from a catalog and altered by her own skilled hands. Nathaniel, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him on Wade's arm, the older man having insisted on giving her away in the absence of her father. Their vows were straightforward and heartfelt, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When the sheriff pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed Victoria with such tender reverence that several of the ladies present dabbed at their eyes. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the assembled company twice over. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the transformed ranch yard. Victoria had insisted on stringing paper lanterns from the trees, giving the familiar setting a magical quality. Are you happy, Mrs. Valenti? Nathaniel asked as they shared a moment alone, watching their guests dance to a fiddle tune. Victoria looked up at her husband, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. Completely, she assured him, though I'm not sure I'll ever get used to that name. You have time, Nathaniel replied, drawing her closer. A lifetime, in fact. As the last guests departed and they stood together on the porch of the home they now truly shared, Nathaniel marveled at how dramatically his life had changed in the span of 6 months. From solitude to partnership, from mere existence to a life rich with possibility and love. "What are you thinking?" Victoria asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking about that advertisement," Nathaniel replied, smiling down at her. "Wade claims it was my idea, even if I was too drunk to remember it." "And do you believe him?" "I'm starting to," Nathaniel admitted. "Maybe some part of me knew what I really needed wasn't just a housekeeper, but a partner, someone to turn this place into more than just a ranch. Into a home," Victoria finished for him, leaning into his embrace. "Exactly," Nathaniel agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You walked in and turned it into a home." 3 years later, Broken Spur Ranch had transformed almost beyond recognition. The house, once neglected and bare, now stood proudly with fresh paint, curtained windows, and flower beds bordering the wide front porch. An addition had been built to accommodate the nursery needed for their growing family, first for James Thomas Valenti, now 2 years old and the spitting image of his father, and soon for the child Victoria carried, due to arrive in the spring. The ranch itself had prospered as well. With Victoria managing the household and accounts, Nathaniel had been able to focus on expanding their cattle operation and beginning the horse breeding program he'd long planned. A small but steady stream of income from Victoria's preserves and honey, sold at the general store in Guthrie, provided extra funds for improvements. They had hired help now, a young cowhand named Miguel who lived in the bunkhouse with his wife Maria, who assisted Victoria with household tasks. The increased production demanded more hands, especially with Victoria's pregnancy limiting her activities. One crisp October evening, the family gathered on the porch after dinner. James played with wooden animals Nathaniel had carved for him while Victoria worked on a quilt for the new baby. Nathaniel sat in the rocking chair he'd built the previous winter, watching his son with undisguised pride. "Papa's story," James demanded, abandoning his toys to climb onto Nathaniel's lap. "Which one would you like tonight, Cowboy?" Nathaniel asked, settling the boy more comfortably. "Mama's story." James declared his favorite request. Victoria smiled, setting aside her quilting. It was a familiar ritual, this retelling of their own history in terms simple enough for a toddler to understand. "Once upon a time," Nathaniel began, catching Victoria's eye over their son's head, "there was a lonely cowboy who worked his ranch all by himself for many years." "No friends?" James asked, though he knew the story by heart. "He had a good dog named Scout," Nathaniel amended, "and some cattle and horses, but no people to talk to, no one to share his meals or his stories." "Sad cowboy," James pronounced solemnly. "Yes, he was sad, though he didn't know it," Nathaniel continued. Then one day, a brave and beautiful lady came to his ranch. She had traveled very far looking for a new home. "Mama," James exclaimed, pointing at Victoria, who blew him a kiss. "That's right," Nathaniel confirmed. And though the cowboy was surprised to see her, she stayed and started to change things. She cleaned his house and cooked delicious meals. She planted flowers and vegetables. She took care of his animals. And made everything pretty, James added, embellishing the story as children do. "She did," Nathaniel agreed. "But most importantly, she made the ranch into a real home, and while she was doing that, something magical happened." "They fell in love," James supplied triumphantly. "They fell deeply in love," Nathaniel confirmed, his gaze meeting Victoria's over their son's head. "And they got married and had a wonderful little boy named James." "Me," the child crowed delightedly. "You," Victoria confirmed, rising to join them. "The most precious gift we could have asked for, and soon you'll have a little brother or sister to play with." James patted her rounded belly with gentle hands, a ritual that had become part of their daily routine. "Baby coming soon," he said confidently. "Not too soon," Victoria laughed. "We have to wait until spring." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Victoria led James inside for his bath and bedtime. Nathaniel remained on the porch, reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment of profound contentment. When Victoria returned, she settled beside him in the second rocking chair, her hand naturally finding his. "He's asking for you to tuck him in," she said. "Apparently, Papa does the best monster checks." Nathaniel smiled. "I'll go in a minute." I was just thinking about how different my life is now from what it was 4 years ago. Better or worse? Victoria teased, though she knew the answer. Infinitely better, Nathaniel replied without hesitation. You know, when I first saw you standing by that broken-down wagon, I had no idea you would change everything. Nor did I, Victoria admitted. I was simply desperate for a fresh start, somewhere far from painful memories. I never expected to find such happiness here. Nathaniel squeezed her hand gently. Do you ever regret it, leaving civilization behind for this rough country? Victoria considered the question seriously. Not for a moment, she said finally. Boston had culture and convenience, it's true. But it never had you, or James, or this sense of building something meaningful together. I found my true home here, Nathaniel. With you. Inside, James called for his father, his voice carrying through the open window. Nathaniel rose, dropping a kiss on Victoria's upturned face before heading inside to perform the nightly ritual of checking for monsters under the bed and in the closet. Victoria remained on the porch, her hands resting on her belly where their second child grew. The desert night surrounded her with its vast, peaceful quiet, so different from the constant noise of the city. Stars blazed overhead in a display no eastern sky could match. A gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and the distant lowing of cattle. She thought about the twisted path that had led her here, the loss of her husband, the struggle to support herself, the desperate gamble on a newspaper advertisement that turned out to be both mistake and miracle. If any single element had been different, she might never have found this life, this love. When Nathaniel returned, Victoria was smiling softly to herself. Happy thoughts? He asked, resuming his seat beside her. The happiest, she confirmed. I was thinking about fate and how sometimes our greatest blessings arise from what seem like mishaps at the time. Like a fake advertisement, Nathaniel suggested with a grin. Exactly like that, Victoria agreed, though I still maintain it wasn't entirely fake. Someone knew exactly what we both needed, even if neither of us did. Nathaniel reached over to take her hand again, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. I'm just grateful you were brave enough to make that journey and stubborn enough to stay when you discovered the truth. As if I had any choice, Victoria replied, her eyes bright with love. The moment I saw this place, saw you, something told me I was where I belonged. And you were right, Nathaniel said simply. You belonged here, we belonged together. As night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about plans for the ranch, for their growing family, for the future they would continue building together. The house behind them glowed with warmth and light, no longer a lonely outpost in the wilderness, but the heart of a home created through love, perseverance, and the unexpected journey that had brought a solitary cowboy and a widowed Easterner together on the Arizona frontier. Inside and out, Broken Spur Ranch reflected the transformation that Victoria had wrought from the moment she arrived. What had once been merely a place where Nathaniel worked and slept had become, through her presence and their shared love, a true home, a haven for them both, for their children, and for the dreams they continued to pursue together under the vast Arizona sky.